Mark Pertschuk, JD, is currently Director of Grassroots Change and was the Executive Director for Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights for many years. During that time, he ran a grassroots campaign to ban smoking on all commercial airline flights in the United States. And as one of those ducks out in the county, I want to just give a personal thanks to Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights. They provided critical technical support and private investigative services for all of us who were doing the local fight. So, Mark.
Thank you all for coming, and especially, for everyone for coming. There's staff here from my organization, Grassroots Change, and Pre-emption Watch, a project of ours, and Stan brought some of his colleagues as well from UCSF, and I didn't force anybody to come from my staff. I want to put that on the record. Stan has overcomplicated what made tobacco control successful and what continues to make it successful. If you were forced to distill it into three things, say, one of them would be Stan. And this is not a joke, or I'm not really trying to kiss his ass, because I told him that he gave me the one thing I wanted from him 30 years ago, which is he was on the hiring committee for the legislative director of Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights. And they gave me that job, which was a very nice thing to do. But the reason is that there's a lot of smart scientists and researchers, and I'm sure medical professors, lots of them. But it's so unusual to have someone who's equally smart about strategy as science. And that's what I'm going to say. I don't want to say too much about that. But it really, Stan was probably in 1978, before I was involved, and is today like a neutron bomb dropped on the tobacco industry. And I've seen enough of other people nationally and internationally who do similar things to know that he's not a secret weapon, because he's pretty well known, but you get the idea. I was asked to talk a little bit about Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights and the work of Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights, which is directly relevant to the work that I'm currently doing and doing with my colleagues. I was president and executive director and a lot of other things from 1986 to 2014. And I'll talk in a moment about the basic core strategy of Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights and its 501c3 educational foundation, the American Non-Smokers' Rights Foundation. But Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights does a number of things. Back to Basics is the core, kind of the core creed, which I'll talk about. It provides a grassroots movement umbrella organization for the national and hopefully to a growing extent international smoke-free movement, anti-tobacco movement. It's a tobacco industry watchdog, and does a lot of work around preemption, which is certainly the highest domestic priority of the tobacco industry in the policy realm, and maintains its own website, which is nosmoke.org, and protectlocalcontrol.org, which is a website that Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights maintains in collaboration with the American Cancer Society nationally. I and my colleagues have directly taken from that lesson the work that we're doing into Grassroots Change now, which is multi-issue outside of tobacco, hence why we're learning more about food, as well as other issues such as pesticides or firearms violence. And the only thing I'll say about the work that we're doing, which has been funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation since 2009 and now through 2016, is that we've based our work on research and the evidence that we glean from that research across lots of issues, not just tobacco, which we have a pretty good, especially since Stan and the work that he's published in his research and others. We know a lot about Ken Warner, about taxes and so on and so forth. We wanted to look at all these other issues, and this is just a small fraction. So we're basing the work that we're doing on grassroots movement building and public health on evidence, and also as part of that, we're basing the work that we're doing on preemption on evidence. The core, as I said, the core paradigm that Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights operates under is in which they refer to as their Back to Basics program, is the power of local control. And the fact that the kind of work that Holly and her colleagues are doing in food and nutrition has a couple features that are unique, very powerful, and to some degree quite especially powerful in the United States because of our history in the federal system. The ability to respond to diverse needs, the process that occurs in this kind of discussion, even when the opponents are sleazy and spend enormous amounts of money, the discussion in education leads to a certain kind of education and understanding that not only leads to support for policy change, but can lead ultimately to fundamental social change or cultural change, as in the case of tobacco. And there are other reasons for this paradigm of local control and back to basics, such as the relative ease of enforcing a health policy or public health law through the combination of local education and local enforcement mechanisms. And very briefly, we've built on the model of Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights, looking at the evidence from a range of public health issues. And the reason that this is so important, that what Holly and what the coalition in Berkeley is doing and the coalition in San Francisco is doing, is that it leads to certain benefits or outcomes for public health that are difficult, if not impossible, to achieve through other programs or interventions. The power you can build with a real grassroots movement can lead obviously to policy change, but the educational process that Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights and others have tested leads to the type of social change or cultural change, and we believe it crosses numerous public health issues. It's not limited to tobacco control or to marriage equality, which is another example of a grassroots movement, but it has almost universal lessons, at least within the domestic policy in the U.S. So one of the main things we learned is that these issues are different. Like you could spend, especially within the walls of a university, whether it's a law school or whether it's a school of public health, you could debate for millennia the differences between alcohol and tobacco, or alcohol and food, or I guess alcohol is kind of a food, sort of, but is alcohol a food, Pat? You should know if anyone knows. But the point is, that's almost irrelevant to the discussion we're having today, in my personal opinion. What's relevant is how do you get from A to B if you don't have Stan working full-time on your issue, which would be nice for all of us. And the answer is that the tactics in these issues, and this is whenever, at least when you have an industry or a set of industries or corporations on the other side, which applies to dozens of issues, pesticides, GMOs, and without getting into the substance of the issues. The lessons we learned about grassroots movement building, including the sub-issue of preemption, is that the tactics have been identical, as Stan has already referenced, and as Lynn is going to discuss in detail, as specific to the food industry. So I just put this together, and I'm not going to go into these because, among other things, we've covered them. Stan's covered them already to some extent, and Lynn is going to go into them as well. But front groups, obviously, per Stan. Preemption, I'll discuss that briefly, and hopefully in a way that's entertaining and visual. Buying friends, that is like when the Coke, I think it was, gave a contribution to NAACP in New York, and the NAACP came out in opposition to portion size, local portion size regulation. But there's, tobacco industry gave donations, I think, this is not my expertise, but to Alvin Ailey, the company, and they did ads in like the New Yorker, which actually didn't take, the New Yorker didn't take tobacco advertising, but took full-page ads funded by Philip Morris or Altria, right? I believe this is correct. My memory's failing. I'm sorry?
They gave money to
Okay. Altria or Philip Morris. Right. So that's buying friends. Buying politicians. Do I have to say anything about that? No. National strategy, this is important to know. What's happening here is being orchestrated to a very significant extent by groups within the Beltway. It's national. It is, and this this is part of a chess game where the opposition knows a lot more right now about how to play the game than we do here. I happen to be a resident of Berkeley, and I have a thing on my front yard. And our neighbors have a thing on their front yard, and their neighbors have it. And cross-issue opposition. I'll talk about this very, very little, but it's important. It really, for here, it's just to understand that the opposition becomes more and more sophisticated and with time. And it's not just resources. It's that they're really, really good at what they do. Not always, but most of the time. And finally, this is just to get back to the first comment I had. Both products, bad, can be bad, but not necessarily fatal. It's important that in getting into these conversations about alcohol, where you can have, if you follow the Surgeon General's guidelines for drinking alcohol, it can be okay or beneficial, and that's different than tobacco. And it's probably most certainly different than e-cigarettes, which are not on the alcohol side, they're on the tobacco product side, in that they are bad. And so the only two I'm going to talk about are the cross-issue thing. This is, so this is states, and I'm using this as an example because we've studied it. These are states which have currently preempt at the state level. They have state preemption that takes away the power of cities and counties to adopt smoke-free laws, or stronger smoke-free laws than the states. It's called preemption. So this is tobacco control, where actually it got up to 23 states, and then the movement for tobacco control has been repealing these to the point where now 8 or 9 states have repealed state preemption in tobacco. This is a reference point. This is in food. And this is 9 states, I think, that have so far, really mostly in the last 2.5 years, the state legislature in these states has taken away the authority to one degree or another for any local entity, municipality, to pass anything, ordinances or rule or policies around food and nutrition. And this one, again, for comparison, this is paid sick days, which is a very vital campaign that's related to the minimum wage campaigns that I think many of you are familiar with. Failed at Washington because Washington's a failure. Failing for the most part at the state level, but winning at the local level. Beginning to win significantly. Milwaukee, San Francisco, New York City, requiring paid sick days for employees. This mostly affects people who work at McDonald's or other low-paid employment positions. And what is interesting about this is the following. So this is paid sick days preemption, mostly passed in the last 2.5 years. And this is food and nutrition. Do you see any similarities? It's 8 and 9, but 6 of the states are the same. And that's not a coincidence. The reason is that it's the what we call the other NRA, the National Restaurant Association in Washington, and a handful of other colleagues have been managing this campaign with a very long-term vision from Washington. They have simultaneously achieved food preemption at the state level and paid sick days preemption in Wisconsin within about 2 months of the same time. That's the cross-issue thing, and that's relatively new. When Stan and I were young, you were fighting the tobacco industry, and some of the lobbyists were the same for, like, alcohol would hire it, but there's another level that's going on here that's worth being aware of. And the second thing is, and the final thing, and the only other piece of the checklist that I'm going to draw out is on preemption, just to show how much can be learned from what happened in tobacco for other public health issues with corporate industry opposition. Back when, this is from Stan's work and from the work of Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights. First of all, if you want to know about whether or not the food industry is the new tobacco industry, what's the best way to find out? Without asking Stan, what's the best way to find out?
Trade terms.
Go inside. Close. Go inside. If you could really be literally bugging their meetings. That would be the best way to find out what the National Restaurant Association or Anheuser-Busch or Coca-Cola was doing. Without it, really get in there. And Stan and others have helped achieve that to an enormous degree with tobacco, with the settlement and the library that's one of the pieces of his empire at UCSF. So this is what the tobacco industry said. We now know our first priority has always been to preempt the field. First priority, to preempt the field. Ideally at the federal level, but because the federal government can't do anything, at the state level it's the second choice. And then another inside quote, we're dead serious about achieving preemption in all 50 states. Well, what about food? 2010, the ACA, the federal Obamacare package, included in its 2,700 or 1,700 pages federal preemption of stronger state and local menu labeling. And this is what the International Franchising Association said. Preemption is good news for the junk food franchises. And digging deeper into the industry, this is a PowerPoint presentation from inside the National Restaurant Association. This is their actual slides. So 2006, nada, or almost nada, and then 2010, there's this explosion of grassroots activity around menu labeling, state, local level proposals, passages, many of them, if not all of them, or not most of them, stronger than what the federal preemptive language had. And so what the National Restaurant Association says is, this is our victory. Federal preemption, yes. And that's, again, it's very reliable because it's from inside the industry. I'm not going to get into this very much, but we can loop back to it if we want to. This is just what are some ways of fighting, and all of us, Lynn, Stan, and I can address this. This is our website, and thank you very, very much.